Sentinel's Gift and Sentinel's Embrace were the staple starters for supports for most of Season 8 so far. But with patch 8.4, Compassion received some very interesting buffs that makes it a competing option. Ahoy! My name is ZiSotto, and in today's video we're going to look into Compassion and Sentinel's Embrace and compare them, especially regarding their passives, on the current patch to see which one is really better. In that context, we also need to talk about how Compassion really works, because the passive description is actually not quite clear about multiple things, so we'll dig into that as well, and all of that will be accompanied by gameplay footage of the best support pick ever. Jokes aside, let's have a quick look at the base stats of the item first before we get into the more substantial material. As you can see, both items are around the same price point, 2000 gold on Sentinel's Embrace versus 2100 on Compassion. In the base stats, both come with 60 protections. In Sentinel's case, that's equally split between physical and magical. Compassion straight up comes with 60 magical protection. Both provide health. Sentinel's Embrace has 200 of that and Compassion has 300 health. Both provide MP5, 20 MP5 on Sentinel's Embrace and 15 on Compassion. That's not important for us though. What is important is that Compassion also has 45 HP5, which is a lot of sustain. In addition to that, from the next patch onwards, Compassion also gets plus 8 gold per 5 seconds for some quicker access to other items. Now, if we were to look at the base stats alone, then Compassion would clearly win as long as the enemy team has any amount of magical damage that would warrant building any magical protection. If the enemy team only had one magical damage dealer, for example, you could just literally build the rest of your build focused on physical defense and utilize Compassion as the magical damage counter. So this isn't an issue unless the enemy team literally has no magical damage. But obviously we need to factor in the passives here as well. And Sentinel's Embrace provides you with further protections. In most situations that will be between 26 and 40 physical and magical protection. This heavily swings the base stats in Sentinel's Embrace's favor. You're now looking at 70 protections each in many situations along with the 200 health, whereas Compassion only has 60 of one with 300 health and some HP5. And Compassion's passive doesn't provide you with any further protections. So if you're purely looking at an egoistical perspective and what provides you the most protections, then you should opt into Sentinel's Embrace. However, if that is your only goal in a game, then you should probably be playing solo and not support. Compassion's tank stats are very comparable to Talisman of Energy with almost the same price as well, and it also comes with 45 HP5, so it's still a good defensive item choice for the price tag that it has. And then keep in mind that you're also getting extra gold, so you get access to more defensive items quicker. And now let's get into the real meat of things, where we learn how Compassion actually works and what goes into it. I'd like to thank Angel for helping me out with this testing in general, and also Flareboot for pointing out this first thing here to me. What you see here are the results of a Sobek with some power and pen items using his 3 on Odin, and that Odin is affected by a Compassion from Geb. So the first 2 damage numbers here are for Odin taking the damage, and then the second 2 numbers are for the transferred damage to the Geb. And as you can see, the Odin takes 182 damage after mitigations, and the mitigation factors in the reduction from Compassion as well. And the mitigated damage here is 104, so significantly less. The damage that Geb takes, who has Compassion, is 15, while he mitigates 17 damage. Now what you will notice here is a disparity between the damage taken and the damage mitigated. The Odin takes roughly twice as much damage as he mitigates, but the Geb actually mitigates more damage than he takes. Part of that is explained by him having more magical defense through Compassion, but there's actually more to it. And that's what we find out when we build some penetration on Geb, who is the one who has Compassion. In that case, the damage taken goes up. If Geb builds 30 flat pen, he actually takes 19 damage and only mitigates 14 damage. If he builds a 30 flat pen and 40% pen, then he takes 24 damage and only mitigates 9 damage. Do you know what that means? The damage that is transferred on by Compassion is dealt by Geb to Geb himself. So if you build penetration on a tank, you will take more damage. Fortunately for you, you can't, for example, apply Stone of Binding to yourself, so that won't be an issue. And outside of that, most tanks aren't building much pen. You find some exceptions with Staff of Murden sometimes, but generally speaking you won't deal much damage to yourself most of the time. And that is why I also don't think it's necessary to heavily invest into magical defense. I know a lot of people are like, okay, if I build compassion, I have to build 3 other magical defense items. You can do that and reduce this damage further, sure, but it's generally already super low damage. It's 15% of what the others take, and then it's only dealt with your own penetration, which is super low. So really, you don't have to go heavy on magical defense. You can just build compassion and will probably not take much damage from it anyways. Most of the time you don't even have enough allies in range to really notice that damage. A small downside of that seems to be that you can't crit yourself. So if an ally gets crit, then you cannot reduce the damage that you take through compassion with spectral armor. Alright, so that's our first step in understanding compassion. The other thing that we need to understand is the threshold of 100 damage, because the description doesn't really clarify if that's damage the enemy deals to an ally or damage you take yourself. What the passive states is damage taken by allied guards within 70 units of you is reduced by 15% up to a maximum of 100 damage. In order to figure that out, we first deal damage to a target that only has the base protections, level 20 Odin, with 76 physical protections. The resulting damage here is 451. This is our crit with Anhur, and now we do the same thing on the first hit of a crit with compassion applied to that same Odin. The resulting damage here is now 383. With some quick math, we can find out that 383 is 85% of 451. In other words, the damage is reduced by 15%, as compassion describes it. Since we dealt way more than 100 damage to the target, this means that the passive refers to the damage that can reflect to you. And you won't believe what the threshold for that damage is. It is literally 667. The ally needs to take 667 or more damage for it to go over the cap of what can get reflected to you. That furthermore means that this refers to damage after mitigations, because otherwise Anhur's damage is already 793, which would be too much and it would not fully mitigate, but it does. So the damage values that we're talking about where this actually kicks in are really high, especially because the mitigation from compassion comes into play before that as well. So only super high burst abilities that don't have multiple ticks would reach that, like a Scylla ult for example. What this tells us so far is that Sentinel's Embrace is extremely generous in terms of how its passive interacts with other things, and actually favorable in any way that you can imagine. But how does the aura compare to Sentinel's Embrace? Let's find out. The first thing we have here are the stats for compassion. A target with 76 physical protection affected by compassion will take 383 damage and mitigate 410. A target with 276 physical protection, so the high end, would take 179 damage and mitigate 614. Now let's look at the scenario where the ally has Sentinel's Embrace. If you have 76 physical protection before Sentinel's Embrace, then you would take 367 damage and mitigate 427. If you have 276 physical protection, then you take 191 damage and mitigate 603. We can see a little bit of a rift here, so to speak, when it comes to the damage taken depending on how much protection you have. If your ally has compassion and you only have base protections, then you take 16 more damage, but if your ally has compassion and you have high protections, as here, then you would actually take 12 less damage. This makes sense because it's a percentage damage reduction. So that alone honestly looks slightly favorable for Sentinel's Embrace, especially because you usually want to protect your squishies. But the story doesn't end there. There's a fact about the passive that we haven't brought up yet. Compassion's passive applies to everyone equally, no matter how many allies are around. Sentinel's protections get split when there are more allies around. So let's have a look what happens when your party rolls up. If an additional ally is around, so 2 allies and the person with Sentinel's Embrace, then the damage numbers already shift in favor of compassion. You would now take 393 damage with the base protections, or 197 damage with the 276 protections. So you'd already take at least 10 damage more. And if we go even further and you have 3 allies around, then you will now take 405 damage as a squishy, or 200 damage if you're very tanky. At that point the winner is super clear, we don't even need to talk about 4 allies. Now it depends a little bit on who you are in a teamfight. If you're more of a frontlining support or more of a backlining support, sometimes you will maybe really just shield 1 ally, but typically I would say you will get the aura on at least 2 allies. And there's another thing worth keeping in mind here. When the support items were changed, the ranges were also adjusted. Sentinel's Embrace is 55 units, which means that it gets split a little bit more quite easily now, but Compassion went up from 40 units to 70 units, so it's very easy to reach allies even if they are further away. And since this is a radius, this covers a massive additional area, and I think that is a big part in what makes the difference between these two items, because it's really easy to cover most of your teammates in many fight situations, and that gives you a lot more freedom in how you can play the team fight instead of essentially trying to hug the ally that you're trying to shield. What we can't neglect here is that these items also have tier 1 items, and I will say that I think Sentinel's Gift is the stronger tier 1 in early game especially. It provides you with more sustain, and in early levels it also provides you with way more gold. Especially if you're just sitting in lane, even if you didn't farm anything else, Sentinel's Gift would provide you with 84 gold per minute, whereas Benevolence on level 2 would provide you with 48 gold per minute. That said, Benevolence scales higher in the gold gain throughout the match, and it also provides gold while you're dead in base or roaming. Still, Benevolence cannot match Sentinel's Gift in early sustain. How much of a problem that is really for you to decide. Especially for a newer player, I would also say it's much easier to just build tank boots in Benevolence and then rely on the passive farm, so you don't have to be quite as farm efficient, and you also don't need to be as good with positioning once you get to the upgrade point. So what we learn from this is if you can stick through the slightly rougher early game, Compassion is probably the better choice in most situations. You get more survivability for your team, and you also get more gold, even more once patch 8.5 drops. Sentinel's Embrace is mostly worth it if you need very high sustain in the early game, you want to stick very close to a specific squishy ally in late game and you're not looking to build too many other auras, or the enemy team really just has no magical damage whatsoever. And I'll be honest, most of these scenarios are relatively rare, and especially if you're not perfect with your positioning, I think you're getting more out of Compassion. But even the pros in the SMITE Pro League are almost always building it now, so it really isn't a bad choice for anyone. Hope you enjoyed this, and if you want to see more videos like this, click like and subscribe, or I will go to my garage, hide in the corner, stare at my home gym, and contemplate if it's harder for me to find. Thanks to my patrons for making this video possible. That's That Nick Walker, Dwayne Brennan, Lenta25 Green, Zelaria, Zed the Undead, Nevitz Jr., Rawas, Angel, Z Ferroli, and everyone else you see here.